Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, I'm talking about a film that was made in the depths of the Second World War and is one of the great films of that war, but it's not just a war film. It's the story of the life of a soldier, and it is both a stinging critique of that way of life and also a deeply sympathetic account of that way of life. It is a very romantic film, and it is also an attack on the illusions of romanticism. It is a hard-nosed, hard-edged, in some ways quite cynical film, and it's also lush and gorgeous to look at. It is the unforgettable, in many ways the unimprovable, the life and death of Colonel Blimp. In 1942, Laurence Olivier, who was the greatest actor in England, and also by that point a movie star. He'd made Rebecca in Hollywood with Alfred Hitchcock. He was a matinee idol. He was married to Vivien Leigh, who was the star of Gone with the Wind. He was a very, very famous actor. Wanted to make a contribution to the war effort. He'd signed up. He'd got a commission in the Navy in the Fleet Air Arm. But I think everyone understood that Olivier's main contribution to the war would be to make a war film that boosted morale. And one of the films that he was offered in 1942 and was recruited, the hope was he would play the lead, was a film called The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, which was going to be made by the duo of Michael Powell and Emeric Pressburger, who were going to become two of the best-known filmmakers in England. They weren't quite that yet, but they were well-known, a serious pairing. And this was a serious and very interesting role for Olivier. It was going to be the story of a soldier's life across 4 decades plus of that life. So the lead actor would have to play this man, the Colonel Blimp of the title, but actually he's not called Colonel Blimp in the film. That's just a nickname. It doesn't really come up. His name is Clive Wynne Candy, or sometimes just Clive Candy. And it was going to be the story of this man's life from his 20s through to his 60s. So the actor would have to play him across these decades. You need to be a versatile actor. And also it's a challenging role because you need to be both sympathetic, but also essentially you're playing a caricature. And it seems that Olivier was tempted, but the government, which got wind of this, blocked it. They didn't want Laurence Olivier playing the part of a character based on Colonel Blimp. Colonel Blimp came from a cartoon by the cartoonist David Lowe. He'd been around since the mid-1930s, and the cartoon strip was a caricature of a reactionary, stick-in-the-mud, head-in-the-sand, bluff, red-faced, walrus-moustached, old army officer who spouted nonsense, reactionary, cliched, jingoistic nonsense of the kind that a certain sort of British military officer might be expected to spout. He was passionate on all sorts of subjects in this cartoon. He was always red-faced, often seen coming out of a Turkish bath with a towel around his waist, steam coming out of his ears, mouthing off about how everything's gone to pot, and we must do this, and we must do that, and we must stand up for this, and we must stand up for that. And none of it made any sense. That was the caricature. So a typical Blimp cartoon, and they usually began with him saying, "Gad, sir." He says, "Gad, sir, we must build a bigger navy than the enemy will build when he hears we're building a bigger navy than he's building." That's a Blimpism. So the government suspected that a film which was about a Blimp character was going to be an attack on the British military establishment. This was 1942. The war was not going well. In 1942, the British Army had just suffered perhaps the worst military defeat in its history, the fall of Singapore, the surrender of Singapore. There had been almost no military successes. The country was still hanging on. It hadn't been invaded. But 1940 and the heroism of 1940, the Battle of Britain, was already a distant memory in 1942. The government was under real pressure. And their assumption was that this film would be an attack on the fact that the government and the military in this war were themselves somehow stuck in the mud. They were somehow not up to speed and up to date and capable of adapting to the new challenges. And so the Ministry of Information and the War Department let it be known that Laurence Olivier would not be released from his commission to play this role. Instead, they dangled in front of him later on a film that he was to make in 1943, which was much more to their tastes, Henry V, another film about an English soldier, happens to be a king. And that was the film that Olivier made. It came out in 1944, and it gave the government, though by 1944 the situation was different, but nonetheless it gave the government the film it wanted, which was a tribute to, a celebration of British pluck and British morale. This band of brothers, that kind of thing. And that's the war film that Olivier is known for. Powell and Pressburger had to find another actor to play Colonel Blimp, and they found a much less well-known actor, a man called Roger Livesey, who actually probably is better for the role. If you see this film, it's very interesting to imagine what it would be like if Laurence Olivier was playing Clive Wynne-Candy. But it's very hard to imagine anyone other than Roger Livesey playing him in the way that once a film is made and it's successful and it works, the character becomes the actor becomes the character. So the film got made with a much less famous star. It still made the government very nervous. And there is a memo from the War Department which has got a scrawl on it from Winston Churchill in which he says, for God's sake, someone stop this film from being made. It sounds like the sort of thing that we shouldn't allow to be made, this nonsense. And it was pointed out to Churchill that it wasn't a great look in a war that was being fought against tyranny and oppression to start censoring movies that might be a little bit critical of the government of the day. That was sort of meant to be the thing, that the war was being fought against, and freedom in the grand sense, but also in the specific sense of not censoring criticism, was the cause in part that it was being fought for. And so Churchill backed down. He had a tendency to sound off, steam coming out of his ears. But of course, that was his fear. He was a bit blimpish. And anyone who read the script would have good reason to suspect that there was a dig in this film at Churchill himself. So Clive Wynne-Candy, the lead character, we discover in the film that he went to this grand public school called Harrow. Well, so did Churchill. Churchill and Candy went to the same school. Wynne-Candy, Winston Churchill. Candy is a war hero from the Boer War. He gets the Victoria Cross, which Winston Churchill never did. But like Churchill, who fought in the Boer War and also in Sudan, that period, right at the end of the 19th century, the start of the 20th century, the young Churchill was a insanely brave, somewhat quixotic, crazy soldier, as Candy clearly was. You don't win the Victoria Cross without being a little bit crazy. He was an imperialist, like Churchill, an imperialist. He was a kind of romantic about war, as Churchill was. Then in the film, we see him fighting in the First World War as a much older officer, as Churchill did. When Churchill left the government in 1916, he went to fight on the Western Front, as Candy does. So Churchill may have thought that Clive Wynne-Candy, therefore Colonel Blimp, was him, which is why he didn't want the film to be released. Churchill was quite sensitive to criticism. Churchill was a round person, literally, physically round. One can imagine him in a Turkish bath, wrapped in a towel, red in the face with steam coming out of his ears, and the 60-something Wynne-Candy, Colonel Blimp. He doesn't look quite like Churchill, but he's bald and he's bluff. But Churchill needn't have worried. When you see the film, it doesn't come across at all like a film designed to somehow take on or attack Churchill or the government of the day. That makes it, or would make it, much too parochial, and it's not a parochial film at all, even though it's a very, very English film. It's also very cosmopolitan. Powell was English, but Emeric Pressburger was an émigré from Europe. The film has a European feel to it, and also it has a connection, in fact, with two of the films that I've talked about already in this series, neither of them, in any sense, English. So this film does actually have something in common with Citizen Kane, and it also has quite a lot in common with a film I suspect must have been there somewhere in the deep background of the minds of the people who made it, La Grande Illusion. So what it has in common with Citizen Kane is the setup of the film has the same narrative arc, and it's about the same kind of puzzle. Citizen Kane begins at the end of a life, and the life and death of Colonel Blimp begins not at the death of, but right towards the end of the life of Clive Wynne-Candy. In Citizen Kane, the question that the film poses is, how did he become like this? By the end of his life, Kane is a kind of caricature of a person. He's set in stone. He's rigid, inflexible. He is a newsreel character. He is like a cartoon cutout of a human being. He seems completely rigid in the person that he's become. So it's almost impossible to imagine that he was ever anything else, but also how he became like that. It's as though That's who he always was. But Citizen Kane tells us his life, and it shows us how he became that person. And it reminds us that people who are old and caricatures of themselves were once young. No one is born that way. And Kane certainly wasn't born that way. And famously, it sets this up through a puzzle, the question of who or what is Rosebud. And turns out that Rosebud, perhaps or perhaps not, the clue to this man's personality comes from much earlier in his life. The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp does something similar. It takes someone who is literally a caricature. So he's not called Blimp in this film, but everyone gets the reference because it's there in the title. He is this cartoon character, a literal cartoon character. And we first encounter him in the film in a Turkish bath with a towel around his waist, with this walrus moustache, red in the face, steam more or less coming out of his ears, absolutely furious. He is Colonel Blimp. But what the film is going to get us to think about is, how did he become this person? And Blimp himself, Candy himself, reminds the young officers with whom he's having a furious row, younger men who regard him as ridiculous, as a caricature. They see him as Blimp. He reminds them, and this is the theme of the film, that he was once young. Everyone old was once young. So they weren't always this person. There is a reason why they are this person. And he also, by implication, reminds these young officers that they will be old themselves one day. One day they will be caricatures of themselves. They think now they are free-thinking individuals who are doing the right thing. But whatever that thing is, one day it also will ossify into a character trait which to the next generation will seem ridiculous and absurd. And the Rosebud in The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp is his moustache, the walrus moustache. No one's born with a walrus moustache. No one has to have a walrus moustache. It's a choice. With Blimp, it's as though it's a part of his natural physiognomy, but it's not. At some point, this man must have chosen to grow this moustache. And that is the puzzle or the mystery at the beginning of the film that it tells us it's going to explain. We're going to be taken back to the early life of this man, and we're going to discover the meaning of Rosebud / the walrus moustache. Why does he have it? And it turns out the reason that he has his moustache and has always worn a moustache doesn't necessarily explain why it quite has taken the shape that it has, but nonetheless, he's always been a mustachioed gentleman, is that when he was young, he fought a duel. And in that duel, he was scarred quite badly across his upper lip. So he carries a dueling scar across the front of his face. And the moustache was grown to conceal this scar, because the scar is evidence of another kind of man. Colonel Blimp was a man who fought a duel. Clive Wynne Candy, as a young man, fought a duel, and we see the duel, which is one of the key events in the life of this man and the life of this film. And so the moustache is literally concealing who he was. And it's partly concealing who he was because dueling wasn't the sort of thing that British army officers were meant to do. It was a very German thing to fight a duel. German students, German army officers in the early 20th century, when the duel takes place, it takes place in the first few years. We don't get the exact year, but the first few years of the 20th century. At that time, dueling scars were a badge of honor for Germans, but not for British officers. So a moustache had to be grown to conceal it. But nonetheless, this is a man who fought a duel. What did he fight the duel over? Well, that's the connection with La Grande Illusion. The duel was fought with a German army officer, but the German army officer with whom he fought that duel becomes the great friend of his life. And that friendship is a friendship between a British officer and a German officer that crosses enemy lines. His great friendship is with a combatant. And like in La Grande Illusion, both these men, who have never met each other before they fight this duel, simultaneously understand, as de Bourdieu and von Rauffenstein understand in La Grande Illusion, when one shoots the other, that both of them have to play this role. They have to play the role of combatants. And so in The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, they are slashing at each other's faces with swords, and they might kill each other. In those kind of duels, death was very, very rarely the outcome, but certainly it was a dangerous business. If you're cutting each other's face, you can slice an artery if you're not careful. just as von Rauffenstein just wants to give de Boieldieu a flesh wound in La Grande Illusion when he tries to escape, but he misses, shoots him in the stomach, and causes him an agonizing death. And duels have been known to end that way too. Both men recognize that they have to do it, and both men recognize the complete absurdity of it. What on earth are they doing, slashing at each other's faces? The cause of the duel in The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp is that Candy has come back from the Boer War with his Victoria Cross, and he's recuperating. And he gets wind of the fact that things are not going well in Germany because all sorts of German propaganda is being spread about how appallingly the British have behaved in South Africa. And Candy doesn't believe any of that. He believes that his side are the good guys. They've been fighting a good war. He believes that the Boer War is a good war. He's wrong about that. And some of the stories about appalling British behavior we know are true, including the creation of concentration camps. That's what the British did in the Boer War. But Candy wants to go to Germany and sort of set them straight. These stories are actually the work of a sinister German spy. They're all nonsense. And they're poisoning relations between two countries who ought to be friends. He has a very clear understanding that Britain and Germany ought to be friends. And he's passed a letter from a young woman who's working as a governess in Germany who says, look, it's terrible the way in which we, the British, the English, are being vilified. And can't that nice young man, who seems to be a war hero, Clive Wynne-Candy, come over and sort of put the record straight? So he comes over, he meets this woman, but immediately, because he's hot-headed, not in the kind of walrus moustache, steam coming out of his ears way, but he's just like the Churchill way. He's a young man in a hurry, and he's not totally in control of his temper. He's hot-headed, so in a cafe, he gets into a shouting match with some pompous German officers. There's a ridiculous dispute over what the band is playing. And he ends up insulting the entire German army. And so the entire German army challenges Clive Wynne-Candy to a duel. And this is a diplomatic disaster. British army officers are not meant to be fighting duels, certainly not against the entire German army, certainly not when they've been sent to Germany in part to sort of smooth things over. It's a disaster. But everyone understands he can't back down. You can't pull out of a challenge of a duel. This is British honour that's at stake. And the Germans let it be known that they will simply pick a member of their officer corps to fight him. And Candy is a very brave person. He attends this duel with great sang-froid. They come to get him for the duel and he's asleep. He's a good chap. And he finds himself facing a man he's never met before. And there's a great scene where they just look each other in the eye just before they start fighting. And the look is of mutual recognition and mutual bafflement and just a tiny bit of fear because this situation is not completely in their control. And then they start slashing at each other. The man he fights turns out to be a German officer called Theo Kretschmer-Schuldorf. So Clive Wynne-Candy, Theo Kretschmer-Schuldorf. It's not quite as grand as de Boieldieu and von Rauffenstein. These two people in Colonel Blimp are not, strictly speaking, aristocrats in the way that the other two were, but they're pretty posh. You know, they're officer class. The duel happens, we don't see it apart from the beginning, but an ambulance is seen leaving the scene. And it turns out that, and this is the most satisfactory possible result, each of them has inflicted a significant, but by no means life-threatening wound on the other. Candy's been slashed across his upper lip, and Kretschmer-Schuldorf has been cut across his forehead. And so they both are going to require some time in hospital to recover. It has to be covered up. It would not be good at a time of heightened tensions between England and Germany for this to make the newspapers, the idea that this duel has been fought, so it's covered up, they're sent to the same hospital. The woman who sort of is responsible for this, who invited Candy over, is there to nurse them. And, of course, when they meet each other, a bit like de Boieldieu and von Rauffenstein, they realize they have far more in common. There's far more that connects them than divides them, even though they don't speak the same language at all. So that's also reminiscent of La Grande Illusion. But language is not the barrier. They play cards together, they drink together, they joke together, they flirt with the woman together, and they become the best of friends over the course of 6 weeks. And then at the end of those 6 weeks, the German agonizedly has a confession to make to his great friend, Clive. He assumes that the woman is Clive's love, but she's not. She's fallen in love with the German, and the German has fallen in love with her. Her name is Edith Hunter. She's played by Deborah Kerr. And Both of them are agonized because they feel that Candy will be outraged. And Theo Kretschmar-Schuldorff sort of assumes they're going to have to fight another duel. Having fought an absurd duel over military honor, they're going to have to fight another absurd duel over the love of this woman. But Candy says, "Oh, old chap, I'm absolutely delighted," and gives them his blessing, and off they go. But the other thing that we discover at this point about Clive Wynne Candy is that he is a great romantic. So Colonel Blimp, and this is one of the central themes of this film, Colonel Blimp is a romantic. You wouldn't know it from the cartoon strip. He is, in cartoon form, the least romantic figure imaginable. He has sort of romantic illusions about the British Empire and Britishness, but the idea that he was once actually a romantic in the other sense, a kind of young lover and lover of love, would seem absurd. But here he is convincingly played by an actor where you can see the blimpishness in him, and yet also he is absolutely a romantic. And in his blimpish way, his problem is he is in love with Edith Hunter, but he's so thick-skinned and lacking in self-reflection. He's so in the world, but not really thinking about his place in the world, that he hasn't noticed he's in love with her. And it's only when she goes off and he's given this union his blessing, and he's effectively never going to see her again, that he realizes he's given away the woman he loved. Now, he also probably realizes she didn't love him, so it was doomed. But he spends the rest of his life looking for her. He never gets over this. He never gets beyond it. He is frozen in time, not in the blimpish way because he is a relic of late 19th century British imperial delusions of grandeur, which is the implication, the political implication of the Blimp character. In this film, we see the reason why Clive Wynne Candy is frozen in time is because he never got over losing this woman. And he literally spends the rest of his life looking for her. So we see his romantic attachments going forward. And in the film, one of the great devices in the film is that each of the women whom he discovers this woman in, different women, is played by the same actress, Deborah Kerr. So first of all, he comes back to England from Germany and he tries taking her sister on a date. That doesn't work because she's not the same person. But then, much later on, when he's a considerably older man, he's lived a single life because he's never found the woman. In the First World War, by now he's in his 40s, and he's starting to look a bit blimpish. He is on the Western Front, this is 1918, and a new consort of nurses has arrived, and they're sitting in a nunnery where he's taking shelter, hundreds of them. And he notices that one of them is the spitting image of Edith Hunter, because it is the same person. It is Deborah Kerr, but it's actually a different person. It's a young woman from Yorkshire called Barbara, and he pursues her and he marries her, and he ends up marrying the woman that he lost. And he's very happy with her. And then she dies. And again, he is disconsolate, all at sea. He's lost the woman he loves. But when we see him at the latest stage of his life in the Second World War, he's found her again. He has a driver, a young woman. This is now 1940, 1941, 1942. We are now in a war where women are serving. And in this case, this woman is serving as a driver. And we are told that he had the choice of any young driver he wanted, and he chose her. He picked her out of a lineup of hundreds. Why? Because it's Deborah Kerr. Because she looks like the woman he lost. He never, ever gets over it. It's an echo of a later film, and the way it's done, the same actress playing these women, is almost certainly, I think, part of the inspiration for Hitchcock's Vertigo, in which James Stewart and Kim Novak go through something like this. James Stewart thinks that a woman has been lost, and then he sees a woman on the street who looks the same as the woman who's been lost, and he tries to turn her into the woman that he's lost. In that case, he's confused. It is the same woman as well as the same actress. In this case, it isn't. And in Vertigo, it is both somewhat romantic and extremely creepy. And it's pretty creepy in Colonel Blimp too. I mean, there is something not quite right about the way in which this man tries to recreate the woman that he's lost. But it's because he is a romantic frozen in time. That's who Colonel Blimp is. And the other thing it turns out that he is romantic about is war itself. He is a romantic about war. He believes that war is a contest between good and evil, and that his side always happens to be good. So the British deserve to win the wars they fight because the British are good and decent people. And he recognizes there are good and decent people on the other side too. So his friendship with Theo Kretschmer-Schuldorf is based on his knowledge that this man is a good German. He is the classic good German, but the Germans aren't good. And they reveal that they're not good in the way that they fight wars. So we see him right towards the end of the First World War, when he's now a senior officer. And this is right before the armistice. So we're in late 1918. He must have seen things. We're not shown his wartime experiences. He's clearly been on the front, maybe for 4 years. He must have seen unspeakable horrors. But being the thick-skinned kind of person he is, he hasn't given up on the idea that this has all along, the First World War, been a war for decency. And the reason his side have to win is they are the decent side, and the Germans are absolute brutes. And we see him on the day that the war ends. He is on the front with his loyal Batman, and they get word via telegram that the Germans are going to surrender. And then the shelling stops, and they hear birdsong. And it is a moment where the things that he thought he was fighting for, a restoration of not just normality, but a kind of beauty, is made audible and visible in the moment. And he gives a little speech. And in his speech, he said it had to end like this because right had to defeat might. The Germans were might. We were right. And thank God, in the end, we prevailed because it shows, it demonstrates that in the end, if you fight a war the right way, you will win. And no commentary is made on this, but we know it's nonsense, and we are meant to know that it's nonsense. The British didn't win the First World War because they were better people than the Germans. And indeed, in the spirit of historical accuracy, it is clear that in 1918, one of the ways in which the British and the French, and by this point the Americans who joined in, defeated the German army was being more brutal, more ruthless. They turned their army finally, it took them 4 years to work out how to do it, but they finally turned their army into a killing machine. And that included the use of chemical warfare in 1918, finally working out how to do it effectively, how to effectively use the weapons of mass destruction that were at their disposal. There is no way that Blimp's lesson about the First World War is the right one, but he is not a man to change his view, and his view is romantic. And because of the kind of man he is, he also believes that once the war is done, then there is no reason why decent relations between Britain and Germany can't be restored. And that's his next illusion, which is that the Germans will see that right defeats might. And so they will learn the error of their ways, and they will come to accept that now the future of a stable and prosperous Europe depends upon the nations of Europe getting on better, but also recognizing that they have to play by the rules of the game. And the first way in which he's disabused of this is he discovers after the war that his old friend, with whom he's more or less lost touch, the man who married the woman that he loved, Theo Kretschmer-Schuldorf, served as a German officer and was captured at the end of the war and is now being held in a prisoner of war camp in Britain, in the home counties in England. And so he goes to visit him. And he's so excited about going to visit him. And he's going to see his old friend again, and he's convinced they're going to fall into each other's arms, and a bit like after the duel. And the duel in Win Candy's eyes is a kind of version of the First World War. It was absurd, but it had to be done. And now, in this case, because the other side weren't playing by the rules and actually weren't decent chaps, they had to be defeated. More than just a flesh wound. People had to die. But now that it's over, the absurdity of it all can be recognized, certainly between him and a good German. So he goes to visit Theo, and Theo won't see him. He blanks him. He goes to find him among all of these officers who are watching a concert on the grass of this nice English country home. And his old friend won't even look him in the eye, won't acknowledge him, will have nothing to do with him because he is humiliated. And the war for him has not been a romantic experience. It's been an utter catastrophe. Clive Wynne Candy thinks that bygones can be bygones. That's part of his romantic view of the world. You fight hard, you fight with everything you've got, you give it your all, like the duel. They were trying to hurt each other in that duel, but when it's done, it's all bygones. It's card games, and it's drinking sherry together, and it's falling in love with the same woman. And the world has moved on. Germany, after the First World War, is not a nation in the mood for letting bygones be bygones. And it is Theo who has to explain this to him. So he does eventually track him down when he's on his way back to Germany. And Theo is a little more forgiving, and he comes to dinner at Clive Candy's house, where there's a whole selection of members of the minor British military and political establishment, ministers and senior army officers and diplomats and so on. And they're all men, obviously, sitting around after dinner, all putting the world to rights. And Clive Wynne Candy gives his version of what should happen next. We've got to restore decent relations with the Germans, and the Germans will learn the error of their ways and so on. And you can see, and he more or less says it, Theo Kretschmar-Schuldorff thinks that his old friend is just a fool. He has no understanding of what this war has done to Germany, of the anger, of the bitterness, of the way in which, to the defeated side, British claims of decency and bygones are just rank hypocrisy. The idea that the other side won because they were the side of right, given the peace they've just imposed on Germany, a nation that they effectively starved into submission and are now grinding under their boots. That's the German perspective. And Clive Wynne Candy just can't see it, because all he can see is a world in which, in the end, decency wins out. And he's still holding to that belief when we encounter him in 1940. And this is the moment where he reveals himself to be nothing like Churchill. So by this point, he's a very senior army officer. He's a general, but he's retired. But when the war hits in 1939, he's brought back. They need all hands on deck to mix army services, metaphors. And he comes back, and he is trying to serve his country and do his duty. He's an old man. He's Colonel Blimp by this point. He's the man with the walrus moustache in the Turkish bath with the towel round his waist. But he also puts on his old uniform, and he's ready for battle. And the battle is still the same one he always thinks it is. The British need to fight. They need to win against these brutes, against these beasts, the Germans. And he recognizes that the Germans seem to have become even more beastly than when he last encountered them. He knows that Hitler and Nazism is something probably beyond even his ability to order the world in terms of romantic ideas of how war is meant to play out. But he totally knows what his side is about. They are about defeating these kinds of people and their way, their unspeakable way of fighting war. And this is 1940, so he doesn't know how unspeakable it's going to get, but he's seen enough of it. We encounter him post-Dunkirk, and he's seen enough of it. He's seen the Germans strafing civilians from the air and dropping bombs and doing the things that he blames the Germans for in the First World War, essentially treating civilians and neutrals like cannon fodder. These people are monsters. And he's invited by the BBC to give a morale-boosting address to the nation of the kind that Churchill did after Dunkirk, when Churchill has just become Prime Minister. And we see him going to the BBC to give his address. And he's taken aside by the producer, and he is basically retired on the spot. He is told, because the government has seen what he was going to say, that he will not be giving his address. And indeed, he then gets a letter almost immediately that says, you are being retired again. You are no longer in active service. You are not wanted. Indeed, though this isn't said, you are a menace. What was the thing he was going to say in his radio address? Well, he shows it to his friend Theo Kretschmar-Schuldorff, who by this point has left Germany and has come to England as an émigré, as the actor who played him, Anton Walbrook, had come to England as an émigré from Nazi-dominated Europe. Theo reads his address and rolls his eyes and says to his old friend, you don't have a clue, do you? You just don't understand. Because in this, Candy thought the way to rally the nation was to say, given how unspeakable the Germans are, I would rather lose this war than resort to their methods, which is not what Churchill would have said or did say. And indeed, was not what could be allowed to be said on the BBC, that we would rather lose this war than fight them at their own game, because their own game is monstrous. The message has to be, we are going to beat these bastards by any means necessary. And Blimp can't see it because he is still a frozen in time romantic, not because he's Blimp, but because of who he was and how he became that person, how he acquired that moustache. He was a duelist. He was a lover man. He was a romantic about war. And by 1940, his romanticism about war is the thing from which he has to be disabused. And he is disabused by his friend, because his friend, who has lived a different life, they start in the same place on either side of this duel, swords in hand. But because of the experience of their countries, they live completely different lives. One of them gets the woman and has a happy marriage, but in a defeated nation. And Theo Kretschmar Schuldorf leads a tragic life. And the tragedy of his life is, as a good German, he sees his country go not just bad, but go evil. And there's nothing he can do about it. He has to leave. One of the reasons he leaves is because he has nothing to keep in Germany, because his wife is now dead. But he is also, estranged is not even a powerful enough word. He is completely cut off from his sons because his sons are Nazis. And they have disowned him and he has disowned them. That is his tragedy. And it is heartbreaking, and it is a heartbreaking performance. It is one of the great performances in this film by Anton Walbrook. Deeply sympathetic. He sees how ridiculous his friend is because his friend has had none of these experiences. His friend has suffered loss, but it's the kind of loss where he just tries to get back in the saddle and carry on. He loses the woman, so he finds her again. He loses the woman, so he finds her again. There is no finding of his sons again for Theo. They are lost forever. His country is lost forever. And he comes back to England. I say back, but it's not a land he's ever lived in. He's only ever been there as a prisoner of war. But he comes back and he tells his friend Clive that the reason he's come back is because his wife grew up here, and his wife is his home. She's now dead, but she's his home. His sons are no longer even his family. So he needs to go back to where she was at home. He needs to go back in time to the place that she lost by moving with him to a country that became the worst place in the world. So he is also going back to the past and trying to recover something that has been lost. But the difference between him and Clive Candy, the difference between him and Colonel Blimp, is that the German knows what he is doing is trying to recover something that has been irretrievably lost. And his English equivalent doesn't know it. He thinks he is trying to hold on to something that's still there. And that's the difference between them. And then we get the final stage of Colonel Blimp's life, of Clive Candy's life. He is retired from the army, but he needs to do something. He needs a purpose, and he's still a patriot. You know, he doesn't change. He's had his lesson, but he never learns his lesson. He thinks that the Germans will learn their lesson. They don't learn theirs. Of course they don't, because it's the wrong lesson. He thinks they're capable of learning, that decent chaps win. But he also doesn't learn his lesson, which is decent chaps don't win. He still wants to carry on fighting the good fight, and he finds his perfect vehicle for it. He becomes one of the leaders of, in fact, the implication is, I think, the leader of, the Home Guard, that group of part-time soldiers who were created in Britain to guard essentially against a German invasion, and who are probably best known in popular culture. And this won't mean much to anyone listening outside of the UK, I don't think, but I think people listening in the UK will know exactly what I'm talking about. Best known in British popular culture as the basis of a great comedy sitcom on the BBC called Dad's Army, which was about precisely these kinds of soldiers. Men who haven't joined up, who are either too old or too young or have flat feet or are doing jobs that mean they can't join up but are faintly ridiculous. Don't some of them know quite which way of a rifle is up, but are endearing in that comedy, but are led by a man who is completely Blimpish. So in Dad's Army, the head of that little bit of the Home Guard that we see is called Captain Mannering, and he is more Blimpish than Blimp himself. He's a completely ridiculous figure, standing on ceremony, often saying the most absurd things with steam coming out of his ears. I think one way to think about Colonel Blimp, for someone who hasn't seen it, but who has seen Dad's Army, is to imagine a film, and it would be a very interesting film, about the early life of Captain Mannering. Because no one is born like that, I don't think. You have to become that person. And Captain Mannering must have been a young man once. And it's very hard to imagine a young man who is also that caricature of a person. So there is a story there. And that's the story that The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp tells. It tells it by reminding us that the caricature is not the person. There has to be a story where the true person has reasons to become the caricature. I don't know what those would be in the case of Captain Mannering, but I would love to find out. We do discover in this film. So the Captain Mannering, the Colonel Blimp of the Home Guard, Clive Wynne-Candy, finds his calling again, and he loves it. But he's still playing by the rules. And the setup of the film, which becomes the climax of the film, is a war game exercise that is happening, in which he has set it up to prove that his chaps, the Home Guard, are going to be capable of fighting and resisting a German invasion if it comes. And he announces for this exercise, for the purposes of this exercise, that war begins at midnight. That's the signal that the exercise begins. It starts at midnight. And the people who are going to be the enemy, in this case, get wind of it. And so they decide to teach this man a lesson again, which is that the enemy don't play by the rules, particularly not this enemy. War doesn't begin at midnight because you say it begins at midnight. War begins when they attack you. So they decide to come early, disrupt the entire exercise, take him captive in his Turkish bath, which is where the film begins and where it ends. A new, young, aggressive, take no prisoners, more classless, more meritocratic, more 1940s breed of young army officers. Nothing like Clive Candy, the Boer War hero that we see at the beginning of the film. So the people who take him captive at the end of the film are the same age as he was at the beginning of the film. They are the young, headstrong army officers. And he recognizes a bit of himself in their headstrongness, but they are nothing like him because they have learned the lesson, which is that war is not a romantic game, and the people who play by the rules don't win, they lose. And if the enemy are monsters, you are going to have to make yourself a kind of monster to defeat them, because that's the only way that victory will come. You have to fight them at their game. Not entirely, not completely. You have to remember what you're fighting for. But you cannot win by decency. And that's the lesson they try to teach him. Does he learn his lesson at the end? I don't think so, because he never learns his lesson because he's Colonel Blimp. The point of him is he's incapable of learning that lesson. That's why he's a romantic. That's, in a way, why he's a caricature. At the same time, it's impossible not to feel for him. By the end of this film, he is a profoundly sympathetic figure. He is a lost romantic at sea in a world he no longer really understands. But he does, even if he doesn't learn his lesson, make his peace with it, because the thing that he is above all else is a patriot, and the film ends with a rousing patriotic moment in which he salutes this new breed of officers and their troops as they go past. He recognizes that the torch has passed on. It's no longer his world. He's not going to give up on the things he believes in, and he's going to remain friends with the good German, but he won't learn the lesson that the good German has spent a lifetime trying to teach him, which is that being a good German is not enough. And my God, you'd think he'd know the lesson by now, because his friend, the good German, is in exile, estranged from his sons, widowed, broken, sadder than it's possible to imagine a person to be when you look into his eyes. But Clive looks into his eyes and just sees his old pal. He'll never learn, and there's something incredibly touching about that. And because in the end, this is a sympathetic film, a romantic film, a patriotic film, and a beautiful film, beautifully acted, and one of the early colour films in a kind of gorgeous colour. There was nothing for Churchill to be worried about, and Churchill realised there was nothing for him to be worried about, and according to a report in the Daily Telegraph anyway at the time, so I assume it's true, Churchill attended the premiere of The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp in June 1943, and he was able to attend it partly because things had really changed from the summer of 1942 when this film was being mooted and was about to be made, and the government was pretty paranoid about public opinion because things were going really badly in the summer of 1942. That was in many ways the low point of the war for Britain. The Nazis dominated the whole of Europe. The British Army was in retreat in the Far East. The Americans hadn't yet made a decisive difference to anything. memories of the First World War. By 1943, even if the tide hadn't quite turned, as Churchill said, certainly the beginning had ended. El Alamein had happened, the British Army's morale was back up, and Churchill could afford to be magnanimous about this film, which it wasn't hard to be magnanimous about because it is a lovely, gorgeous, sympathetic, patriotic film. And the end of this film, seen in that light as a gorgeous, patriotic film, also takes us back to the beginning of the film and the other side of the story it tells. A kind of different story in a way from the Citizen Kane one, which is really focused on how the young person became old, because we see the old person at the beginning. But there is also in The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp the implication that the young people we see at the end of the film are themselves going to be blimpish one day. This new breed of thrusting, go-getting, meritocratic army officers who are going to win this war because they're going to do it their way, the modern way. They have left behind the illusions of Victorian-era soldiering. They have left behind the illusions of Colonel Blimp. They are going to become blimps in their own time. They are going to create their own myths about this war, that it was the good war, and they fought the good fight. The myths that did indeed take hold, I think, in England, in Britain, after the Second World War, some of which persist to this day. Myths that resurfaced during the Brexit referendum. It wouldn't have been a winning slogan, but blimps for Brexit was part of how that fight was won. But even by the 1960s, there was another generation of young, more meritocratic, more thrusting, more classless, but no longer soldiering men. The generation of the 60s, the Beatles, Beyond the Fringe, the satirists, the subversives, the people who are going to become hippies, revolutionaries, some of them, for whom that class of officers that for Blimp are the thrusting, meritocratic young men have become, by the 60s, the people living on past glories, talking about the glories of the Second World War, asking the question of any man they meet, did you have a good war? That's the key question. Did you have a good war? Blimp had a good war in a way, once they'd fired him, created the Home Guard. Did you have a good war? Because it was a good war. That's the point about it. It was a good war. And in the end, right defeated not just might, but evil. And certain British values came through, British values that people were still harking on about in the 60s and in the 70s, to the bemusement and indeed ridicule of a younger generation who saw it as an absurd kind of myth-making about something that A, was history for them, and B, clearly wasn't as these men remembered it. It wasn't the romantic, patriotic event that they remembered. It was brutal. It was ghastly. They allowed the most terrible things to take place. They were responsible for atrocities. The carpet bombing of Germany, which killed many Germans, many innocent Germans, exactly the stuff that Blimp says, I would rather lose this war than do that, but didn't prevent the Holocaust. Anyone who thought about that war is not going to believe the Blimpish myths about it. But because of the way the world turns, the wheel turns, the generation turns, every generation creates its blimps. Romantics, sympathetic figures, people who were young once, who have a reason for having the moustache that they have, that makes them look ridiculous to the next generation. The moustache conceals who they really are, and who they really are is something real and passionate and full of conviction, but has ossified into a set of myths, a myth particularly about virtue and decency triumphing, the British, the English version of the Great Illusion. The first of the bonus episodes that we're going to be putting out on PPF Plus to accompany this series is going to be available on Saturday. This one was inspired by a list drawn up by one of the interns that we have working with us on the newsletter for this podcast. I asked him to see if he could find out what the favourite films were of each American president, given I was talking about Donald Trump and Citizen Kane. And it turns out that at least 3 presidents, and maybe more, had the same favourite film. It was High Noon. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, partly because it is a great film, but also because it's really interesting trying to work out what it is that American presidents saw in it. And I'll be talking about some of the other favourites of some of the other presidents as well. That will be out on Saturday. To get it, you just need to subscribe to PPF Plus. Click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. It's £5 a month or £50 for the year. You get 24 bonus episodes every year, and there are already plenty of bonus episodes that will be waiting for you when you sign up on political fictions, on American elections, on British elections, on what-ifs, and more. That newsletter, the new edition, is out tomorrow to accompany the first 4 episodes in this series, the 4 films that I've been talking about. It's got guides, writing, and links connected to each of the films. So if you want to see the clip of Donald Trump talking about Citizen Kane, it's in the newsletter. It's free, it's fortnightly. You can sign up again by clicking on the link in the show description or going to our website. On Sunday, in our regular slot, the next film I'll be talking about there is The Manchurian Candidate. We're moving forward to the 1960s, to the age of Cold War paranoia and conspiracy theories. It's an amazing film when seen from today, but it's also really surprisingly funny. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.